Okay, so I believe that what I was asked to do and what I hope to be able to do is take our conversation in a little bit of a different direction than where we've been this morning, and really give voice to the lived experience that each and all of you have with this illness, whether that be from a person with ALS to a caregiver for someone with the disease, either informally or formally, so either a family member or a provider. And I hope to be able to give some perspective on that. I guess I need to acknowledge before I begin that everything I know about caregiving has been learned from being a social worker for 20 years, in which I spent at the bedsides and in waiting rooms and hallways with people with many different diseases and their families, and also through my own personal experience, and then finally through the research that I do, and the generosity of families who are willing to share their stories with researchers so that we can develop interventions and means to help future families in their own caregiving journeys. So I acknowledge that, and I appreciate that everything I've learned has come from people's willingness to share experiences. So my goals for this next 30 minutes are really to kind of reconceptualize and recast what caregiving and care receiving are, is more of a mutual experience. It is not done to someone or received. It's an interchange. It's a reciprocal interchange between people with the disease and those who love them. I also want to be able to consider both the losses and the gains. I think we frequently spend time considering the losses that an illness brings us, but there also are gains to be had and gains to be acknowledged and gains to be valued. And then finally, to really offer some means for incorporating what I have learned to call care sharing rather than caregiving or care receiving within relationships. And it's central to all of us in all of our human relationships. So that's really the framework from which I'd like to work today. Rosalind Carter, who established an institute on caregiving, says there are only 4 types of people in this world and in this room and in our lives. There are those who have been caregivers. There are those who currently are caregiving for someone, those who will be caregivers, and those who will need caregiving. And that covers all of us, and that touches all of us at some place on the journey of our lives. Caregiving has also been really brought into mainstream by a PBS show and website that's called Thou Shalt Honor. And what I love about this is the notion that caregiving calls us into life. It calls us into the moment in our relationships at which we can look at each other in the eye and say and understand that there's something really deeper here about what we need to learn. And it moves our relationships from a caring to a caregiving. So I want to set context. I'm an academic. I just have to bear with me. We have to have a few statistics just to kind of tell the story before we get into some of the messages of that. And I really like to cite Victor Seidel, who is a sociologist who saw the world through 30,000 feet up, when he said that statistics are people with their tears washed off. But I think it paints a picture for us. So just a few, just to set context. And what I'd like to start with is that we are living in an era of caregiving and care receiving. The graph on the left shows you the projected population increase. The top line is in people over age 65. The bottom line is those people over 85. And the graph on the right indicates that 1 in 3 people in our society lives with multiple chronic conditions. And so because of medical technology and medical advances, we are not only living longer, we're living longer with multiple conditions. And so that's the era in which caregiving is ripe. And it's an important time for us to study it, understand it, and to really acknowledge how much of it happens in our society. Within that context of aging and chronic illness, this is the prevalence of ALS, just to show you kind of where that fits in the aging and end of life, or aging and advanced illness continuum. We also need to be on the same page, and so I want to make sure that I give you the sort of standard definitions of caregiving and care receiving. And so caregivers are people who help another person with the activities of daily living, everyday activities of bathing, dressing, transferring, mobility. Informal caregivers are family and friends who are unpaid in that role. People who care for someone that they love and they provide these activities of daily living. Formal caregivers are the providers among us. They're people who are paid for that work. It's aides, it's nurses, it's physicians, it's social workers, it's people who provide care in that way. And these are all equally important in our lives. And a care recipient is defined as someone who needs help with one or more activities of daily living. And that is, again, the basics. It also includes instrumental activities of daily living, such as shopping, bill paying, transportation, or medical care. And the way that I like to think about this is that we receive care on a continuum from maybe needing a little bit of supervision to maybe needing then at the other end all activities of daily living. And there's a whole continuum across which we can really be thinking about this reciprocity and mutuality of this relationship. And even before the actual tasks begin, there's often a period of watchful waiting. I've been in that place with family members where you're just watching and you're waiting and you know that at some point you'll need to step in and maybe take over some of those tasks. So there's a whole journey of caregiving. We're going to start by talking about informal caregiving. So that's family members and loved ones and friends who are here. I'm going to speak to you about kind of what that experience is, and the others will hopefully hear sort of the other side of that, and then we'll move into the other groups. So informal caregiving statistics really indicate that the mean age of caregivers in our society is 50, and the mean age of care recipients is 77, so it's a mid to later life, more common experience. But there are 65.7 million people. 29% of the US population provides care for another person. The average length of caregiving is 20 hours a week for 8 or more years. 13% provide full-time, 40 hours a week of caregiving. 66% are female who will spend 17 years raising a child and 18 or more years caring for a parent. So there's a real juxtaposition of caregiving roles. And then I think it's important to note that 6 out of 10 caregivers are employed, and that sets up a whole different set of challenges and balancing and juggling that has to happen. People who need care, what you see on the right, on the graph on the right, is really that whole range of the types of activities I talked about, and it indicates what kind of, and this is with older adults especially, the kind of assistance that they need, from bathing to dressing to eating. It just kind of gives you all those, it gives you the breakdown. But I think what's important to know is that 7.3 million care recipients are over 65 years of age, but 5.1 million are between 18 and 64, and they're often not seen as care recipients. So being mindful of the different life stages and life experiences in those age groups. And 400,000 are children under the age of 18, who we also often consider kind of invisible care recipients. Most persons needing care require assistance with everyday activities, just so we're on the same page there. And 50% help administer medicine. So that's something that I don't think any of us are born into this life knowing how to do. Even if we're a nurse or a physician, administering medicines to a loved one is a very different experience than to a patient. So just to capture the caregiving experience, it is all these things. It can be stressful, it can be complicated, it can be frustrating, maddening, and saddening. It can be filled with loss, but it can also be filled with gains. It can be discouraging, angering, but I think what's most important to really underscore here is it can also be loving, meaningful, and growth-producing. And more in the scientific literature, we're seeing the benefits of being with someone in this life stage when they need our care. And that I think we need to really emphasize a lot more than is currently done. It would be remiss of me not to mention the sources of caregiver stress that people experience, just to name them. These may be some that you've experienced. Perfectionism, feeling you have to do everything just right, just you have to nail it every day. And who of us can do that, really? Instead of just thinking about, okay, well, we can improve that maybe next time out. Caregiving can be seen as a task that never ends, that has no beginning and has no end. I think when we find that source of stress, it's really important to create spaces, create periods of respite for someone, so there is a chance for a break. There can be work overload, especially for those 6 out of 10 who are trying to balance a job, perhaps child rearing, and also caregiving. It's when someone takes on impossible tasks. I should do this, but I simply can't. So it's understanding our limits is a really important means to helping with caregiver stress. It is juggling multiple roles, being parent, being caregiver, being employee, being friend, being neighbor, being community member. How do you, all those different things at once. It is self-sacrificing. It's the feeling that we have to do it even if we don't want to. And it's unspoken feelings. When we can't put into words the frustration or the sadness that we may feel, it comes out in other ways. And so I think being mindful that caregiving stress is a part of the situation is really important to pay attention to. I think I'm going to step it up just a little bit because I want to keep you on your schedule for this afternoon, so I won't go over all the details and all the slides from here on. Again, I'm an academic. I always fill them with too much to say. But I'll hit the high points just so we can stay on track. So I want to move into the experience of care receiving, which is not very well known. It is not studied in the same way that caregiving is. And I want to acknowledge, for those of us in the room with ALS, what it's like to receive care. I think it's important to name that. And this is one of my favorite graphics. It says, the world of every day with illness is to simplify. And so I'm pretty big on visuals. The lived experience of ALS, you could tell me much more than I know about it. I think that we need to acknowledge what that is for each person as a different individual journey, which can be stressful. It can include research protocols, that it can include all kinds of new medications, all kinds of different things, but different for each person, as we learned earlier today. And living with a chronic illness, this is a repeat of the living with being a caregiver slide. It can be all those same things. It can be stressful, very complicated to learn how to navigate with a chronic illness. Frightening, maddening, saddening, discouraging, angering, but it can also be filled with a left-off love. It can be also filled with love, the love of someone caring for you. It can also be meaningful and very growth-producing if we acknowledge it that way. So I want us to see it as both sides of a coin. Being a care receiver has been studied by Wendy Lusbader, whose book is in the top of the slide, Counting on Kindness, and it's the dilemmas of becoming dependent. And she's interviewed hundreds of people about that experience. And here are some of the themes that she identifies. Learning to live with not being as active as you were really creates a different self-image. Waiting for people to help you is an experience that care receivers acknowledge every day. Time and distance, she finds, really become defined differently. So waiting 5 minutes may feel like 5 hours. Walking 10 feet may feel like walking a mile. And so our concept of time and distance really changes with an illness. There can be a sense of resentment. Why is this happening to me? Why is this happening to us? There can be an unacknowledged weariness, she finds, from needing to receive care. To be of use, finding new ways to be productive, new ways to contribute to a relationship. She talks about, her participants talk about dry tears, the tears that we store up and have no outlet. And I think that's an important thing to think about, is where do we go with that emotion that comes from being a care recipient? I think the last two things are probably, as a social worker, they're the most important to me. It is the refusing to be demeaned. We need to not allow people to be demeaned with a chronic illness. And I love the term medical defiance. So it's getting those answers from providers. That's an important piece of becoming a care recipient that we can learn from. I'm not going to read this to you. This is just a really profound quote. It's in your book. It talks about the kinds of it sort of reframes what time can be for us if we use time in a positive way. So I want to move into formal caregiving. For those providers in the room, there are important messages in this same book about our way of giving care to people. And so the first one is really considering that we are all interdependent. As a healthcare provider, your care recipients and the caregiving family members you deal with, we're all part of the equation. And so truly, what Gandhi said is the truth. Interdependence ought to be as much the ideal for man as self-sufficiency. We live in a self-sufficient society when instead what we really need to know is how much we need and depend on each other. And this is a quote from a person who was very seriously ill and not allowed to get out of bed. And what she says is, in that state of extreme helplessness, I saw how much a person can be in need of others. For those of you who are healthcare providers, please be mindful of how much people need that care and tenderness from you. And also they need mercy. And this is a description of from another participant who was bedbound and talked about how when a nurse came in and squeezed her arm in the morning and helped change her dressing and her gown, that she knew it was going to be a good day. You can't imagine how much it meant to me to be touched that kindly. So mercy is another quality in care providers that is really essential and really important. Just a visual, mercy and tenderness and interdependence. So I want to move us into the concept of care sharing, which is from another book. This was also written by a social worker who frames the idea, rather than caregiving or care receiving, as care sharing, again, the mutuality. That it is together an equation, and that it's a journey that we all take together. It's bounded by the concept of reciprocal suffering, and that is that my husband's illness is my illness. What happens to you and your family happens to the people who care for you. That's really the bottom line. And that we're all living, when we're living with caregiving or care receiving, the stress is continual, but it's our shared stress. This comes from a show back in the day, back in the 90s when I was a young adult. Paul Reiser, and it was called Mad About You. I don't know if anyone saw it, but it was about a young couple who were having their own struggles. And my very favorite quote from the show forever was, "What happens to you happens to me." They happened to be dealing with infertility, and she was pulling away from him. But he said, "What happens to you happens to me." And I've just always thought that completely captures what happens in caregiving and in illness. And so the idea is that there's a dance. It's between the caregiver, care receiver, and with others around us. It is it's the essence of the dance in care sharing. It's what we each bring to the equation. It's not a one-way street. And so Marty Richards is the author that I'm citing here, and I think the book is really, really powerful for anyone who's trying to kind of rethink about their caregiving, care receiving relationship. And she talks about the fact that caregiving is unequally weighted. It is something that we do to someone else. And she talks about the concept of help striking again. When we think we have to do for someone, it may be unwanted, it may be undesired, and so it becomes obtrusive instead of useful. And it forces dependency rather than encouraging strength. Care sharing involves reciprocity. Each of us brings love. Even if we have a chronic illness, we bring love and care to the relationship ongoing forward. And it preserves the respect and dignity. Independence is knowing when to ask for help. Interdependence, it allows you to receive help or care, maybe in a different format. Moving from caregiving to care sharing is when I becomes replaced by we. That's the important takeaway here. Even illness then becomes wellness. And so we can think about living with a chronic illness as a state of wellness on some level. The emotions are shared. This also comes from Richard's book. And she talks about love, laughter, humor. Humor is something so important in a relationship that is care sharing, to never lose that piece, and to honor the opportunities that we can find for growth by reconceptualizing doing things together and doing things differently that we might have done before. She emphasizes being in what's called a learner mode, in taking experiences in and letting them change us. So it teaches us the value of appreciation, the value of having someone do something for you, someone who cares for you, the value of being gracefully dependent. And I'm not just talking about care receivers here. Caregivers need assistance as well and really benefit from friends and loved ones around who can give to them. She emphasizes the importance of trust, the value of love, talking about learning how to cope, the importance of living in the now instead of in the past or in the future. How do we make today the best it can be? Understanding and really valuing what matters the most to us, and being able to talk about that with each other. And to see beyond the symptoms. That's probably easier said than done, but I think it's good advice for us to take to heart. Rebecca really wanted me to talk about losses because losses accompany a chronic illness. And so I think it's incumbent on us to think about and cope with both the big losses but also the small losses every day, but to put them in perspective and try to see some gain and some positives from that as well. And some of the questions that I think are important to ask are, to whom are the changes happening? Are they happening to you or to the other person in the relationship? How are the changes affecting you and your loved ones? So talking about what's happening. And finally, how have you and your loved one dealt with change in the past? There's strength there that you can draw from and you can build on moving forward in an illness. just to briefly touch on maybe some of the losses that you've experienced, but these are some of what the loss and grief literature is now sharing with us. There is anticipatory grief. When something is happening or we expect it to happen, we live sort of in an anticipatory state of what's down the road. We're grieving losses both in the present, in the future, but also in the past as whatever is happening to us is changing us. There's a sense of incomplete grief where current losses that we might be experiencing on a daily basis trigger other losses. So if that happens to you, know that that's a common universal experience. There's a concept of disenfranchised grief. That's losses that are unspeakable. They're losses that are unsanctioned in society. They're losses that aren't really seen as losses. And finally, I think the one that's probably most pertains to living with a chronic illness is that of chronic sorrow, which is that there's a recurring response to a continuing situation. And I don't know if that fits for any of you, but just know that these are some of the kinds of losses that are being studied and really moving into treatment literature and moving into helping us understand the experiences people go through. These are just some means to help cope with grief. Some suggestions in terms of giving people time, giving people permission to feel sadness, encouraging day-to-day functioning, keeping people moving, listening wholly for those of us who care for on either end of the equation, listening wholly and listening below the surface to really know what's happening, helping people work through unfinished business, and searching for meaning and purpose in this illness experience. It's there. We just need to find it and identify it and name it. So I want to emphasize the power of hope. Hope is different things to different people, and hope can change over the course of an illness trajectory. So always recognizing that there are sources of hope is important. What to hope for changes, making sense of what's happening, and recasting what hope might mean to you. In care sharing, standing shoulder to shoulder is really an important thing. Recognizing you're in it together. And then believing in power beyond ourselves. Believe whatever that is for you. Believing that there is meaning to be understood and that there's hope beyond us. Just being there for someone brings hope when everything else may seem hopeless. And so if you think you can't do for someone else, being present with them, listening wholly is a really important thing. This is a set of strategies from a friend of mine and colleague who has been a caregiver for her husband for some years. And these are right out of her own personal experience. And these are things that family and friends can do as well. Making a list of helpful hints for people who are well-meaning, right? Everyone says, call me if you need me. Well, if you have a list that's ready, that could be useful. She suggests putting out a welcome flag when you're ready for visitors, because sometimes people show up at inopportune times or they don't know when to come. If you put out a welcome flag, then people might know they could stop by. Another suggestion is helping people develop strategies for communication about what's changing. Information that can be given about the illness so people understand what you're going through. And these I love. Text messaging someone, I'm at the store, can I pick something up for you? Or I'm at Panera's, can I bring something for you? There's very concrete, practical things we don't think about helping in a caregiving situation. Care sharing is sharing what wisdom the illness is teaching us. It is reinventing family roles, sort of reapportioning who does what and how people contribute to our family. It's sharing not only standing shoulder to shoulder, but sharing soul to soul. It's sharing forgiveness, and it's sharing hope and heart, one step at a time, not too far in the past, not too far in the future, but today. What can we do today? So I want to move ahead to the very end because another colleague of someone who I think is really, this will all be here for you in the slides, but I want to get to this because this is what I wanted to end with, and that is that Ira Byock is a palliative care physician whose work I use all the time and who, for me, is just a real giant in the field. And he wrote a book that's titled The 4 Things That Matter the Most. And for me, this is the takeaway. This is what we can each do in our relationships today. And he says that care sharing will involve some kind of conflict. We can't help it. I want to cast it in a positive light, but there are stresses and there are challenges to our relationships as an illness changes us. But what Byock says is that we can resolve interpersonal difficulties with integrity and with grace. And the 4 statements that always work are, first of all, please forgive me. There is no relationship, no human relationship that doesn't need forgiveness on some level and in some multiple part. I forgive you, recognizing that, again, that's a reciprocal two-way street. Thank you, and I love you. And I'll talk briefly about each of them before we close. So forgiveness is something that we don't forget, but we remember in a different way, but we can move past it. And forgiveness is essential. And Tillich says, in spite of that, I forget, although I remember. Without this kind of forgetting, no human relationship can endure healthily. So forgiveness is something each of us can practice every day. There are two parts to that. Please forgive me, and I forgive you. It can't be one without the other. And Martin Luther King was true when he said, forgiveness is not an occasional act, but it needs to be a permanent attitude, especially in a care-sharing relationship and a care-sharing journey. Thank you. Recognizing what people do for you, recognizing what we do for each other in relationship is really important. And expressing that gratitude, learning how to say that in new ways to people who care for you. And Mother Teresa said there is more hunger for love and appreciation in this world than there is for bread. We all want to be appreciated, an important thing to remember in our relationships. And finally, I love you, or some other emotionally significant statement, if that can't come out of your mouth, something that really acknowledges how much you care for someone. What keeps us alive, what allows us to endure, is the hope of loving and being loved, and that should never be absent in a care-sharing journey. So in the end, this is Cascade Mountain in Acadia National Park, a place I went a couple of summers ago, and it is this source of first light on the East Coast. And so for me, this is a picture. You can decide whether it is sunrise or sunset, and you can decide whether care sharing is sunset or sunrise. And for me, it's sunrise. For me, it's a new opportunity in human relationships. It's a new chance to revisit who we are in relationship with each other and to make that a growth experience. Thank you so much for your time today.